Story 1. I'm from Myanmar. Most young people left the country when the conscription law was enacted. Now, you cannot leave unless you have completed military service, which in this situation means until you die, due to the ongoing civil war and the need for more personnel. Story 2. I remember asking my mom why she left the Philippines in the 1970s. She explained about the Marcos regime and how he declared martial law. She said that when that was announced, she knew she had to leave. She had been working towards moving, but she said that was her cue to hurry up. Story 3. My grandfather left Poland after he was imprisoned in a concentration camp and escaped. He was very clever and bilingual in German. He made it to the United Kingdom at the age of 16 in 1939. Story 4. My family and I left late. The older family members have discussed how they should have left when the government began discussing restrictions on travel outside the country, as that was also around the same time journalists, academics, and even students started disappearing. Story 5. The police began harassing people on the streets following one of the protests in Belarus. Some were killed, some were injured, and thousands were imprisoned and tortured. This is still occurring. I had been psychologically prepared for this for a long time before the violence erupted, as it had been concealed for years. When everything happened, I took the first morning flight and left for another country. The story is more complicated than this. Story 6. I used to know a cleaner who was from Haiti. The right time was in 1980 when the Tante Macoute came for her husband, a political dissident. That was the last time she and the kids saw him. In the case of my first girlfriend, the daughter of a South Vietnamese general, they left the country in a small boat when Saigon fell. During the crossing, the smugglers told her parents, "Either you give up all your gold, or we will harm the women and throw you into the sea." They arrived in France with nothing. The father, a doctor, was then able to work, but not for the same salary as the French. He died a few years later, plunging the whole family into poverty. Once in a while, her mother would tell about what she had left in Vietnam. Story 7. When my parents decided it was time to leave Saigon in 1979, they told us we were going to see Grandma and that we had to leave tonight. However, we couldn't tell anyone and needed to be very quiet. Story 8. When there was no electricity and no water, the police were attacking people, and inflation was at 1,000%. Story 9. When I went to the market, I found nothing but bones. I was threatened at gunpoint for the umpteenth time. One of my neighbors was shot, and I heard his relatives screaming. I witnessed kids dying around me during protests. We were tear-gassed and shot at by the National Guard. The dictator was dancing salsa during a mandatory national broadcast while celebrating the deaths of protesters. I left Venezuela in 2016, and it still hurts. Story 10. My great-grandmother fled the Soviet Union during the pogroms and settled in Germany. The day Hitler was elected, she and her husband started packing and made a break for the United States. Story 11. When they arrested members of the opposition party for holding a primary. When police stormed and shut down the headquarters of the only newspaper still critical of the government. When nonviolent protesters received longer sentences than violent offenders for having posters in their backpacks. When the heads of government were replaced one by individuals with neither qualifications nor experience, based solely on their flattering rhetoric. When they started passing legislation that would harm people, showing no concern. When an additional panel of judges was suddenly appointed above the Supreme Court, with the final decision on interpreting the law. When caring about it makes you lose sleep and affects your work quality. It was never one thing, but you see it getting worse step by step, leading to a judgment call. The timing and reasons will differ among your friends and family. Story 12. My grandfather, the bravest man I have ever known, fled Germany shortly before the Nuremberg laws were passed in late 1935. He had been a lawyer and arranged everyone's passports, hidden some gold, and established a place for them to flee. The judiciary was already under the control of the regime. He took his wife and 5 children and crossed into Belgium through France. By 1936, he was applying for asylum in multiple countries, including the United States, where he knew people in the embassy. He was summarily denied. As they began invading Belgium in May of 1940, the family fled along the coast on foot. separating children and adults to avoid traveling together, hoping their odds were better. My grandmother and my two aunts were caught a few days into the trip and sent to the gas chambers at Treblinka. The eldest son, Mikhail, was caught foraging for food by the Gestapo in southern France and executed on the spot. My father, who was 9, his younger brother Joseph, and my grandfather fled into northern Spain and were hidden by the remnants of the Zamoristas in Catalonia. Joseph developed pneumonia and died somewhere in northern Spain. My grandfather and father were smuggled into Portugal onto a boat and eventually made it to New Palestine. After the war, my grandfather had had enough of the Zionists. He was finally granted a United States immigration visa and came here in 1947. I was born on American soil in 1961. I grew up hearing the stories. I guess this just follows my DNA. Story 13. My mother and her parents left Bosnia in 1991 when the Iron Curtain came down and Yugoslavia began to fall apart. They witnessed the entire conflict and the genocide as the Serbs and Croatians, even under Yugoslavia, treated the Bosniaks poorly. Story 14. Speaking for my grandmother, she left Hungary when the hospital where she worked was directly affected during the October Revolution. It is remarkable what she and her family endured out of love for their country before this. Story 15. I don't know if you've heard of Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, but it was the 2023 Booker Prize-winning novel that explores this question, set in a fictional version of Ireland that has been overtaken by a fascist regime. Story 16. We left Ukraine in 2011. We started the immigration process as soon as we received our visas when it became clear that the leader, Yanukovych, was about to return to power. We were fortunate. It took us just over a year to leave. Story 17. 2 sets of my great-grandparents fled before World War I, which shows their good instincts. One was in the Austrian army, and as an ally, he could see the war possibly escalating due to Germany. He knew he would be sent to fight on a side he felt was wrong and did not like the Kaiser. So he obtained false papers, taught his 4 children to speak Ukrainian, and they escaped to Canada. This was a significant risk. To this day, we are unsure if we are the result of illegal immigration or if Grandma's maiden name is correct. She perpetuated the Ukrainian identity her whole life and celebrated Ukrainian Christmas. Given the anti-German and Austrian sentiment after both wars, I suspect they continued pretending and still used the false papers. Her father died within a year of settling here. A child was born on British waters during the trip, so she may have had dual citizenship. The other great-grandfather was German. They feared being sent to war and found the Kaiser unpalatable. He and his brother fled before World War I as well. He settled in Canada, while his brother went to the United States. They both married fairly quickly. A couple of years later, they met up and discovered they were married to full sisters by chance. The American side, 1 generation later, ran a very successful company. My grandfather met his cousin towards the end of his life. They called themselves brothers as they were the result of 2 brothers marrying 2 sisters, double cousins. They looked alike. As a side note, I looked up the history of my grandmother's maiden name. It is definitely Ukrainian and not even close to an Austrian name. She maintained the Ukrainian facade her whole life based on false papers and culture to escape war. I wish we knew more about why that particular name was chosen. Story 18. My grandfather spent 2 years in prison for organizing a workers' strike against the socialist regime in Poland. Everyone in the family wanted to leave once he was released from prison. Fortunately, years later, the 1989 revolution occurred, and we were able to return. Story 19. When my parents received an envelope containing bullets, each engraved with the name of a family member, along with a letter that read, "Leave." Story 20. Legal immigration today is significantly more difficult than in the past, unless one is fleeing a developed country, which the United States still is, at least diplomatically. Otherwise, nations are increasingly closing their borders, including countries like Canada. Story 21. I can tell you this: prepare your backup plan. Having a US passport makes it easier. I grew up in the Soviet era, experiencing the collapse of the Union and the tumultuous 1990s. I went to the United States in 1999 as a student but decided I did not want to stay there. I did not feel I could live in that country. I simply did not like the way of life. So I returned to my homeland, and many people thought I was crazy. However, I love my country and truly hoped that things would change. I decided to have a backup plan and took the opportunity to obtain a legal status in Germany, even though I do not like it much here. Being in information technology makes it a bit easier. In 2020, it became clear that we in Belarus would face difficulties for another generation. Fortunately, I had my German permit, so I moved my family, leaving behind many things, and started a new life. While I still wait for the time I can return, the fact that I had a backup helped me escape the risk of imprisonment and ensured my wife and children could live in a more secure environment, at least for now. At the moment, I am contemplating a next backup plan. Many people are concerned about recession, but I am terrified of war, and it may come to Europe. To keep the story concise, just ensure you have a safe backup plan and that you can utilize it in time. Story 22. When Putin and Medvedev flipped in 2012, my wife and I looked at each other and knew it was time. It was the best decision ever. Story 23. I think the primary concerns are security and finance. When your mental and physical health is at extreme risk and you cannot trust the law, or when you cannot trust the economy and your savings lose value before your eyes, it becomes easier to buy a one-way ticket. That is just not the way to live. Story 24. I knew it was time when my university professor was arrested during a lecture for simply mentioning democracy. It hit me hard. No matter how much I loved my country, it didn't love us back. Story 25. Possible trigger warning. This is a small but significant part of my late father's life. My late father was a young child during the Spanish Civil War. He was the youngest of a large family. During the war, he lost 10 siblings. Some to bombs. His 8-year-old sister suffocated under the rubble, while other family members died from illness and injuries. During the fall of Barcelona, my uncle, who had the audacity to fight against Franco, walked with approximately 500,000 to 1 million people to the French border. My uncle was placed in a concentration camp and was unable to escape. I believe the only reason he survived was that at 18 years old, he was healthy. When he finally returned to his small town, he confronted the town priest and a couple of nuns, denouncing his religion. This was significant during that time in history. He returned to Barcelona and, against all odds, became a successful businessman. My aunts never spoke to him again. When the fascists won, the reprisals began. My father's 2 remaining sisters, both teenagers, were raped multiple times. When my father was in his late teens, he realized that there wasn't a future for him in Spain. He worked his way across the world on a Greek freighter. He remained Catholic and kept in touch with all of his remaining family, immediate and extended. In Canada, he eventually met my mother, who was Protestant, and they had a good marriage. Religion was never an issue. I admired my father as he wasn't embittered or bigoted. I often asked him how he could remain unbitter, and he explained his reasoning and philosophy. As a child, I lived in Spain for 4 years during 2 different time periods, once near the end of the Franco era. One of my first languages was Valenciano, and I received corporal punishment for speaking it while attending school. This was common throughout Spain. I learned Spanish quickly. I believe corporal punishment is child abuse, and after 2 weeks in school, I refused to attend any further schools in Spain. Growing up in Canada, I never talked about Spain with friends or classmates. I didn't believe in intergenerational trauma. Now, I do believe intergenerational trauma exists and have undergone a lot of therapy to address it. When I was a young adult, I vowed never to set foot in Spain again. It held too much emotional pain and bloodshed for me. However, with therapy and maturity, I changed my mind, and I have visited Spain numerous times. I despise fascism and do not believe violence is the answer to anything, just as my parents and their parents did. Ironically, my maternal grandfather was a pilot in the Royal Canadian Air Force, and numerous other members of my Canadian family also fought against the Nazis during World War II. Story 26. Starvation. My family left China in 1970 during the Cultural Revolution. During that time, many Chinese people were leaving their homeland by swimming the dangerous 4-kilometer journey to Hong Kong. Story 27. My parents left South Africa in 1980, as they were white and the apartheid government did not restrict their travel. They departed in their mid-20s after experiencing adult life under apartheid, which included increasing horror at the state violence committed against black and colored individuals in their name. My father was completing postgraduate studies in science that would have led to a career in a science-based public service. He was already interning in that public service but suddenly stopped being allocated work. It turned out he had been blacklisted for government employment because my uncle was a minor anti-apartheid journalist. My father had also been conscripted into the army, as all young white men were, and when they finally left, his next period of service would put him on the front line of the Angolan War. He did not want to kill people. My father qualified for a skilled migrant visa for Australia, and I was born there. My mother had also grown tired of being treated as a legal minor just because she was married. She became an adult at 18 like we all do, but due to her gender, she was considered a legal minor again upon marriage. My father became her legal guardian. My parents had a postnuptial agreement specifying that my father allowed her to make her own legal decisions, such as opening a bank account for the money she earned at her professional job. However, services would read the postnuptial agreement and still call my father to obtain his permission for her to carry out various tasks. My journalist uncle migrated to the United Kingdom around the same time. He returned for a family wedding in the early 1980s. My parents sent their apologies, and was apprehended by military police within 12 hours of entering the country. He was forced to serve another tour of duty in the army. At another point, his home in the United Kingdom was broken into, and the only item taken was his address book. My family believes this was orchestrated by South African government agents to intimidate him. All of this was supposed to be in the past. We were expected to have learned and grown. Story 28. It's strange to be an American right now. I feel like I should leave, but I can't. I remember when I was young, wondering why the Jewish people in Germany and good Germans didn't simply leave the country when Adolf Hitler rose to power. Now I am older and I understand. Story 29. This morning, they started arresting judges. I was already trying to leave, but that headline sent chills throughout my body. Story 30. I was born in the Soviet Union and watched it collapse when I was 7. Getting out for me was never a question of when it's right, but when I'm able. By the time I was 21, I was legally orphaned and had graduated cum laude from the best college in the country, but my English wasn't good enough to qualify for an international graduate school program. I spent another year in a local graduate program while paying a lab colleague to teach me English after hours. Nobody believed I would go through with my intention to enroll in a graduate program at Ohio State University. At that time, Russia was at the peak of economic growth, and the government was investing heavily in science and technology, leading former Soviet expatriates to return from the United States with promises of becoming local science superstars. It never fooled me. It was clear that those programs were purely for show and that the processes were not meant to be fair or merit-based. Everyone told me I was foolish to leave the clean and beautiful Moscow metropolis for the Midwest. I landed in Columbus, Ohio in 2006 with $300 and never came back. 15 years later, when the first bombs were dropped on Ukraine, panic settled in. My friends abandoned their businesses, properties, and families to escape. My cousin, a male of military age, stayed until the conscription was announced. Due to geographical luck, as our town is a few dozen miles from the border, he managed to get a last-minute train ticket and crossed into Kazakhstan 3 years ago. Did I see this catastrophe coming back in 2006? No one thought it could get this bad. Russia was the best it had ever been in 2006, yet it still was difficult for those in the lower economic class. It was always clear that people like me were not meant to have any future there. I took no joy in my decision. It was made out of desperation, and if I had known about the struggles awaiting me, I doubt I would have had the courage. Imagine how it felt on November 6, 2024, after spending 2 decades obtaining a coveted US passport, to wake up in the second iteration of Trump's country. Do you think a catastrophic collapse can't happen here? Erosion of civility happens slowly, but the system is crumbling in front of you, and far too many people are oblivious to what they are witnessing. Story 31. When they banned us from owning guns for our safety, the gangs did not care, and the government, knowing we did not have any while they did, made sure we knew who was in control. Venezuela, I do not miss you. Story 32. We are Baha'is. Our faith has been persecuted in Iran since 1844, facing murders, disappearances, and kidnappings. My dad, the smartest in his high school graduating class, led a platoon against the sadistic Saddam in Kurdistan as his patriotic duty during the Iran-Iraq War. He was denied higher education for believing in the oneness of humanity, the harmony of science and religion, and the equality of men and women. We moved as refugees to Turkey in 2000 when, a few months earlier in Tehran, my brother, equally bright as my dad, was denied entry to a gifted school because of our faith. That same fateful month, my grandpa and dad were imprisoned for their beliefs again. The United States took us in 2 months before September 11th. For that, I am forever grateful to this land and its generous people. Story 33. It may be a controversial opinion, but if everyone who could afford to leave did so, the most vulnerable among us would be in even worse shape. Obviously, you need to do what is best for you and your family. However, you could always choose to stay and continue the struggle. Story 34. I assume that if you know, then it's too late. You have to guess correctly. You need to find a place that can maintain stability in a world with 3 completely corrupt autocratic superpowers exerting their influence indefinitely. Story 35. I read a book about a Jewish person who left Germany in the 1930s. He realized it was time to leave when people stopped being willing to serve him. His inability to find a doctor or accountant was a clear sign that it was time to go. When being associated with a group is worse than that group paying you, it is a negative situation. Story 36. For my family, when my grandfather was picked up by men in uniform while he was Christmas shopping with my mom and aunt, he told them he just needed to talk to them and sent them to continue shopping in 1971. They were in their teens when this happened and never saw him again. We have no idea where his body is, as those whom my family suspected knew took the secret to their graves. Growing up, we were told he was in the States. They shielded us from the truth to prevent us from talking about it as kids. Story 37. I left the United States in March. I learned from my grandparents that it is better to leave before regretting the decision to move. I have a child with autism, and my husband is European. Now we are finding our way here. I am keeping money in various accounts, enough to fly to Uruguay with inflated ticket prices and cover 3 months of rent if things do not go well here too. I can laugh and tell myself that I overreacted, and my pride can handle that, but I cannot survive if my family is hurt because of my inaction. Story 38. This was not me but my mom, right when the Iran-Iraq War ended. The very first day the border restrictions were lifted, my mom hopped on a bus with 1 bag from Baghdad to Jordan and never went back. It was very hard for her because she never thought she would ever leave, but her whole family was leaving one by one, all heading in different directions when they got the chance. She didn't want to admit it, but she wished she had left sooner. Everything from all sectors was deteriorating, from education to city maintenance. The population of certain villages was disappearing without a trace. She even had a really bad gut feeling that something much worse was going to happen in Iraq, and every sign told her to leave. Her gut feeling turned out to be correct. Even my dad's side realized it too. My family is Christian, and there are no minority rights in Iraq at that time and even now. In the early 2000s, 2 of my uncles were kidnapped, taken to a mosque, and given 1 week to pack up and leave because they were Christian. The only reason they were not killed was that the kidnappers saw they had children, so they spared them. They left as fast as they could and went to Syria. Then the civil war started, and they had to leave soon after that, starting a new life in Canada. Story 39. I asked my parents. They said it began when authorities started arresting people on the street without any oversight or established procedures. Many of those individuals began to disappear, with no record of their arrests and no trace of them in any jail or prison. That's when they knew it was time to leave. Story 40. I think when you see professors such as the 2 at Yale whose expertise is fascism, it is probably time to go. Story 41. It was during the Russian elections in 2000 when it seemed like the worst option was going to win. We had no idea what would happen, and none of us expected a war with Ukraine, but we didn't want to stick around to find out. It took another few years to actually get out, though. Story 42. Whenever they saw people asking the same thing, if you have people inquiring about it, it's about time to pack it up. Story 43. You are assuming that the most vulnerable have the means to relocate and head for the border. The best I can do for myself is travel back north, which is a few hours' drive to the Canadian border, and I am exceedingly privileged in that respect. Story 44. I didn't escape. The authoritarian dictatorship did not survive me. My uncle escaped earlier. He went ashore in Havana for a stroll and decided not to reboard the freighter he was serving on. Story 45. This was a very good question. I'm an American, and if the situation worsens in this country, I have no idea where I will go or how to prepare for it. Any advice is welcome. Story 46. My grandparents and my father fled Lebanon during the civil war after Muslim extremists murdered my great-uncle. Story 47. My family left Poland when it was under the Soviet Union's influence in 1984. I was 5 years old at the time. My father had been writing for the Solidarity Underground newspaper and had been betrayed by someone. I remember the police coming to my apartment to arrest him. He spent 2 years in a Polish prison for subversive writing. After his release, we were told to leave Poland, so we had no choice. We ended up in Canada and have lived there ever since. Now we have Donald Trump on our doorstep, and my father is absolutely furious. Story 48. A friend of mine escaped Cuba just before Castro. They were able to sell their business, hide their cash, and obtain refugee status in the United States. It was a complicated process. Story 49. Not authoritarian per se, but my home country is basically an evangelical majority that I suspect in the distant future might become a religious authoritarian regime if the evangelicals continue to radicalize and influence people. I left there and rejected it all. I'm not going to wait for things to unfold. The world has fewer barriers than people think, and most of those barriers are in our heads. Yes, it is hard, yes, you suffer, and yes, it is miles away from your comfort zone, but it is doable. Story 50. I left the United States in 2021. With a knowledge of history and pattern recognition skills, the signs were clear. I hoped I was wrong, but deep down, I knew I wasn't because I was raised in the far-right evangelical world, and I understand how they operate. I'm still trying to convince my few liberal family members to seriously consider finding a way out, but it's not easy. Story 51. When people fled to the United States in the 1920s, the country was still growing and welcoming to immigrants to support growth, and there were jobs available. The question now isn't when to flee, but where. Who wants us? Where are the jobs? Is the grass really greener? Story 52. My mom and dad in 1973. My uncle was taken to the National Stadium because he was part of a trade union. It was the last time we ever saw him. Story 53. Politicians convinced 90% of the population that all their problems stemmed from the other 10%. They exploited the country while the impoverished blamed fellow citizens who resembled them but spoke different languages and followed distinct customs. Restrictions had been placed on the 10% since my grandfather's time, but most of that did not deter my parents. The turning point for my parents was the riots, during which leaked census data helped identify people's racial identities, leading angry mobs to target as many from the 10% as possible. Once the riots ended, my parents decided to leave with me. Many people remained throughout part of or even the entirety of the subsequent Civil War. So remember, no matter how difficult it may seem, it can always worsen, and it is never too late to leave. It just becomes more challenging. Story 54. Hey Americans, don't just leave. Fight for your country. You have enough intelligent people who didn't vote for what is happening right now. Use their voices, along with those waking up to the reality of what they have supported, to spread awareness and convince as many people as possible. Most people are not uninformed. It's the result of poor education, misinformation, propaganda, and sometimes ignorance. These individuals can be convinced. Protest and take action to save America. Wishing you all the best. Greetings from Germany. Story 55. I am Syrian. My dad decided to leave in 1977. I had uncles who left as early as the 1960s. My dad left because he was arrested and tortured. The secret police wanted information on a person he knew. Apparently, that person knew someone with information on the Muslim Brotherhood. He was tortured for 3 days and held captive for a total of 7 days. He said the only reason he left was that his uncle, who was a judge, was able to pull strings. Story 56. Please do not mention when they began arresting judges. Story 57. My great-uncle and aunt lived in Berlin with the rest of my family in the 1930s. They started expressing concern about the rise of the Nazi movement. Everyone else in the family dismissed them as paranoid and accused them of overreacting. Nevertheless, they left without seeking consensus. They made it to the United States while everyone else, including my grandparents, ended up in concentration camps. As a result, my father always warned me that if the political climate shifts towards authoritarianism, I should never think it can't happen here. It's important to have an exit strategy. It's not only about the former president and the rise of fascism in the United States. I have felt this way for a while. Mass shootings occur every week. People are dying from treatable conditions due to a profit-driven healthcare system, which will ultimately harm us all as we age, with our retirement funds being gambled in the market. Additionally, evolution is being removed from textbooks in many states. It's been unsettling here since at least 1992. Ironically, I am now planning a permanent move to Germany. I received citizenship as part of a reparations program in the 1990s, which also includes the entire European Union. Full circle, I guess. Story 58. Cuba. My husband and I watched a gorgeous movie, Sweet Habana, by Cuban director Fernando Perez. The film has little to no dialogue, just music, and it follows a day in the lives of ordinary Cubans. I remember sitting in silence after the movie ended, turning to my husband, who was as moved as I was. I told him, "We have to leave." With the help of friends, one Canadian and one American, we applied to a Canadian immigration program and left in 2006. My husband worked at a science research institute, and we knew it would be nearly impossible to be allowed to leave since you needed government permission to travel abroad or emigrate. So he left his job and worked in 2 different places consecutively to avoid disclosing his employment at the research center, as they only asked about your last 2 jobs. We also concealed the fact that his parents were in the military. They took our apartment. At that time, you were not allowed to buy or sell houses legally, only to swap. But we were able to leave. Story 59. I don't know if there was any specific moment, but I met my husband in Cuba. After a few weeks, he told me, "I've got to get out of here. I don't know how much more of this I can take." I said, "I'll help you," and I did. We are still together almost 20 years later. Story 60. I'm from Russia and used to do activism. I swore to stay no matter what, but I am also transgender. When the government made my existence in this country illegal, I had to leave. I knew that the only thing I couldn't handle was being forcibly detransitioned and placed in a psychiatric ward. Story 61. When they won another election, I used to be a volunteer worker at the polls in Venezuela in 2013 and prior. I saw firsthand how the military took over the vote count and did whatever they wanted, pointing their guns at us volunteers and threatening us when we asked to see actual evidence of the final vote count, which always seemed to go their way in a riding that was clearly against them. Story 62. The period when China imposed the national security law on Hong Kong coincided with ongoing COVID-19 restrictions. It was not beneficial that the government was bringing in a large number of People's Republic of China expatriates to fill civil service roles, implement the parallel justice system, and replace those who were leaving Hong Kong for various reasons. Story 63. When Putin invaded Crimea, I accepted a job offer to move out of Russia. People around me did not care much, and I thought that Putin realized he could do anything without facing protests. I believed he would turn the country into a full dictatorship, and I was correct. Story 64. From Russia. A yellow warning light was triggered when I saw military forces deployed to Moscow in 2012, including armored vehicles with grenade launchers and other anti-personnel equipment. A red light was triggered when Boris Nemtsov was killed directly in front of the Kremlin wall in 2015. Back then, I agreed to a visa transfer, knowing that it is essentially a form of exploitation, and to this day I feel like I jumped on the last train out of a worse version of the Soviet Union. Story 65. My wife and I watch history shows with a focus on World War II. It is almost like an exact copy of what is happening in the United States right now. The supporters of the former president believe anything he tells them, even when he changes his statements daily or even hourly. We are now sending people to prisons, referred to as concentration camps, in other countries without a proper trial. The former president has also discussed the possibility of sending U.S. citizens there in large numbers. It is terrifying that we are turning into a fascist state. Story 66. Where would we even go? Most of us don't speak any language except English. Plus, who could afford to emigrate? That would be very expensive. It's another thing that only wealthy individuals can do. Story 67. I'm from Cuba, and Castro's regime was quite bloody. However, Trump's second term has everything we observe there: chaotic individuals in government, persecution, lies, and both Fidel and Donald use the same technique. They claim to have made deals and provide numbers that are often unrealistic, like 10 billion. What does that amount mean to the U.S. economy? Story 68. My great-grandparents knew after Kristallnacht. It wasn't long before they put their children on a Kindertransport train. Story 69. I don't judge anyone who feels the need to leave the United States, but I don't think I can. I believe too strongly in the American idea to give up on it without a fight. I love this country and its inspirational charter. We have yet to live up to the American idea, but we've made significant progress. Now we're backsliding. Could be that we're close to a low point and we'll come out of this or not. Either way, I think I'm going to see this through to the end. It would be a terrible outcome for the future of humanity if the United States falls. We would be ceding global leadership to the likes of China and Russia. To be clear, I have no ill will toward the Chinese or Russian people, but their political regimes cannot be entrusted with global leadership. The current United States cannot either. Humanity deserves better. What we're dealing with is a series of collective action problems. I'm really not sure if the American people are capable of the collective action required to overcome this. However, it's also unclear that we aren't capable of it. I think there's hope. We've got to get to work. Story 70. When news became propaganda, well before protests and actual crackdowns, I felt a profound shift. I am from Hong Kong and grew up valuing democracy and freedom of speech. In 2015, I was having dinner when I saw a curious news report. A journalist was covering a story about a government vehicle full of cash that had broken down, resulting in money flying around the street. Reports indicated that residents of Hong Kong had been stealing money, while miraculously not a single person from mainland China took any money. Instead, they returned every dollar, down to the penny, to the government. If you know anything about mainland Chinese culture, you would find it laughable to think that people would prioritize a banking institution over themselves. The obvious propaganda displayed on television was a clear signal to me that my city, my hometown, my rugged concrete jungle, was on its way down. Story 71. 1 year into Trump's first presidency, I knew I needed to leave. The difference was palpable, at least to me as a brown man, even in California. I have questioned myself multiple times over the last few years, but I don't anymore. Story 72. For me, it is now. I have dual citizenship in Canada. I am a black woman and a veteran, so my time is now. The plan is for June 2026, but I will assess the situation in August to determine if I need to leave when my lease ends in December. I was considering extending it to June, but we will see. Story 73. Timothy Snyder, the historian and author, stated to choose your own personal red line and leave when the government crosses that boundary. Story 74. My friend decided to leave Russia after 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time. He saw people around him celebrating Putin and the annexation of Crimea, and he didn't want to raise his child in that environment. It was one of the best decisions I have ever seen. Story 75. I left Russia when money stopped being the source of power and power became a source of money. Regarding the United States, there is a long way to go regarding that issue. I still hold hope for the next election to be genuine. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.